Hey, it's Tim here. I've just spent 4 hours going through the Snowflake Summit keynote. I did it twice just so I could do the summary. So we're going to cover the whole entire keynote, break down what happened, what was announced. As ever, let's get stuck in. Now, for those of you thinking, hey, what happened, Tim? Your tablet, Tim. Well, I'm starting to cover Snowflake, and this is going to be the first video really sort of pushing into that area. I've done Snowflake videos in the past, but I think Snowflake Summit was a good opportunity for me to really start to get to grips with what's happening in the Snowflake space, but also keep in touch and help update you about what's going on. And I think conferences are always a good opportunity to do that. That's when lots of people are paying attention. So it absolutely makes sense. I'm not going to stop making Tableau content. You'll notice that I haven't stopped with that. I'm still covering 23.2. But today we're covering Snowflake. So let's break down the Snowflake Summit as it happened last week. The keynote started with Frank essentially doing a pretty big flex. Now, there was a previous session the day before with Jensen, the NVIDIA CEO, and that is a pretty big flex. The main reason is that NVIDIA hardware is pretty much hard to come by, and Snowflake being able to secure a partnership with NVIDIA, they're essentially the leading hardware provider for AI and machine learning technologies, is kind of a big deal because it really means that that partnership has some strength. NVIDIA even were on stage, pulling out a quote
the big deal here, Sarah, is that we're going to bring the world's best compute engine to the world's most valuable data.
We're coming to the world's most valuable data platform. That was a really sort of important quote to kind of pull out of that conference. And so for Frank to start off the keynote and say, hey, we just had NVIDIA on stage with us, that's how serious we are about the space, was a pretty interesting thing. But he had to immediately frame it and sort of remind people that, hey, AI is a buzzword. And yeah, you might be playing drinking games every time I mention AI, but actually before AI comes a data strategy. That was a pretty nice lead into essentially what the Snowflake platform has. And the next sort of 15 minutes were just Frank essentially outlining what Snowflake is in case you've missed any of the announcements over the last few years, highlighting all the different workloads and exactly how it works. So if we just go through that, I've got my notes here. He started off by really positioning this concept of the data cloud. This is the visualization you see on the Snowflake homepage, but he had the visualization up on stage and he kind of depicted it as like a solar system with the data cloud as the sun. That was the central sort of core of their entire platform. And as we sort of got into this description, Frank was really highlighting the USP of Snowflake, this ability for companies to come onto the platform, start with their basic use cases, and then grow out, expand, do collaboration. And he focused in on a company called Fiserv, and he kind of showed how their node in this data cloud was sort of growing out and how they were touching base with lots of different businesses and also helping come up with new solutions inside of the platform. And all of this is happening within Snowflake. This was sort of the whole point of this narrative. Look at what you can achieve if you just commit to the Snowflake platform. Now, he then went on to break down the workloads very explicitly. And I was actually quite surprised how many workloads there are. When I started using Snowflake, I'm actually a Snowflake customer first, and then I'm a consultant, and now I'm sort of a content creator in many ways. So I've got 3 hats on. I always sort of just saw Snowflake as just a database, and I sort of knew about the peripheral sort of features and capabilities, but only recently have I started to realize, wow, Snowflake really has a really broad remit when it comes to the data space. It's not just a database. There's lots of different sort of capabilities happening on the platform. And so if I just go through them, I've got a list here because I can't remember all of these off the top of my head. Frank started with the concept of warehouses. So of course, warehouses and data lakes are things that we've had for many, many years. I think even in the NVIDIA session, the NVIDIA CEO said that, look, the concept of a database had been sitting on a shelf for years until someone came and made a product out of it. Now, interestingly, that was Oracle. And interestingly, Snowflake founders came from Oracle, so they know all about that journey. But nonetheless, we went from warehouses to data lakes. And then they talked about the product called Unistore, essentially their transactional layer. And that is a pretty powerful capability because later on in the keynote, they do talk about some new capabilities that allows you to sort of use Unistore without compromising some of that capability that you get with a typical data warehouse and the data lake. And then Frank sort of then zeroed in on the collaboration aspects. He just really wants to highlight this. I think this comes up as a running theme throughout the conference. Collaboration is something the Snowflake platform can do, and it can do it well, and it can do it securely. And he threw out a stat here saying 70% of customers using the platform are using the collaboration features, which is quite a big number. That said, 70% came up multiple times, which made me think that it was like a generalized statistic. The exact percentage is probably around 70%, but every time you see a number multiple times, you think, every time everything is 70%, they all can't be exactly 70%. It doesn't make sense. So that was interesting. And then he brought up cybersecurity, the idea that, look, if your data's here and everything's running here, why do you have to go somewhere else to run cybersecurity workloads? Again, that's another workload. We've got data engineering. Apparently 40% of the compute capacity on Snowflake is taken up by data engineering capabilities. And that makes sense. Data engineering is a pretty popular thing. And you pretty much find all the data engineering platforms do sort of dovetail with Snowflake. You look at DBT, all their training, everything dovetails with Snowflake. And so that's a pretty cool capability. And then you have two more, AI and machine learning. Again, the 70% stat came up here, but I didn't quite sort of understand what was being said. 70% of customers have used it, or 70% are using it every single day. I didn't sort of get that breakdown, and I've rewatched and I can't really sort of get the clarity on that. But this is one of those things you just have to sort of go at face value and trust that what they're saying is actually the case. And then lastly, you had examples of applications, apps essentially being used on the platform. So this whole sort of, let's say, universe of workloads was then sort of, sort of brought up on screen, and then around it came the governance layer. This idea that all of this happens inside of the Snowflake platform with governance and security at its core. Security is just a staple part of every database. It's not really unique to Snowflake, but the fact that governance is sort of baked into all of these features was a pretty big selling point. And then there was a small sort of finesse of just really branding the three core parts of Snowpark, which are AI, machine learning, and data engineering. Essentially, those three things come together to form the product, the sort of group of products called Snowpark. That was again put on screen. And then the very last piece was to say to essentially everyone on stage, look, all of these workloads speak to different kinds of people, whether it's developers, users, the business users. All of those are covered by the Snowflake platform, and Snowflake, pretty much welcomes all of those. So that was a really nice, I think, way of, really encapsulating what the Snowflake product is, how it works, but more importantly, just reminding everyone, in case you're new, in case you're an investor, in case you don't know, that Snowflake really is turning into a platform with lots of capabilities, with this sort of focus on your data, and they want you to take part in that data cloud. And they don't see the data cloud as just your data. They see the data cloud as your data intermingled with other people's data, all done in a way that you can trust and secure. So that was I think a really nice sort of framing of the product. And then we finished off with essentially three core areas that Frank sort of wanted to highlight, and it was all under the no limits banner. So no limits for data, essentially being able to give you what you want when it comes to managing your data without compromises. No limits with applications, being able to really look at the app setup as the equivalent of an Apple app store, which is an example Frank gave on stage. And then the last one is no limits on workloads. We want you to be able to do whatever work you want in Snowflake, in the platform, without having to worry about all the other problems. And so these were sort of teeing up the core sort of components of the rest of the keynote. These are what to watch out for, and these are sort of the three things. I like it because three things always works nicely. So that was a pretty nice setup, and so that was pretty much it. And I thought that was a really strong, confident, depiction of the product. A lot of times you go to a conference and you find companies really trying not to sort of narrow their product down to say this is what they do, because they want to speak to everyone, because there's always someone in the room who's passionate about one area but isn't passionate about the rest. So they kind of avoid being really direct with you and saying this is what we're good at and this is what we do. That wasn't the case here, in my opinion, as an outsider. So I thought that was pretty good. The next stage we saw was actually Benoit coming up and talking about the recent acquisition of Neeva. I can never say it correctly, but anyway, let me know how it's supposed to be said in the comments. But it's a sort of an interesting one, because the acquisition is still quite young. It's literally only weeks since the acquisition closed. And what was interesting here is it felt like a credentialization exercise. It was very much a look, here's the founder of Neeva. He's joining Snowflake. These are his credentials. This is what he's been working on. And by the way, we've been working on ML already, and we think this is how it's going to work. And Benoit was very much sort of pinning this down as something that he believes in, something his team is working on, and something Neeva can actually help a lot with. And so there was also some subtle tones to suggest that Neeva have some other capabilities beyond their sort of basic products that actually will help Snowflake's internal uses of things like large language models and AI and machine learning. So it's as much as a purchase of the application as it is a purchase of the mindsets and the minds that can come into the Snowflake universe and help them build new products. So that was really good to see, and it was good to see the founder actually leading that charge whenever something new like that comes up. Yes, the CEO is a good sort of person to sort of announce these things, but actually it meant more to have the founder there to really speak to the technical and the directional sort of push for Snowflake. So I thought that was good. And that was sort of its own little standout section. It kind of felt out of place, but they had to do it. They had to do it early. And to have it second after the CEO before the features was really sort of a statement of intent in many ways. So that was sort of the first two bits of the keynote. The next bit of the keynote was very much the product showcase. And the product showcase was really, really nice. It was broken down into three specific areas, and I'll just read them out here. We had the single platform section, we had the distributed, deploy, and monetize section, and then lastly we had programmability. I can never say this properly. Anyway, nonetheless, it was a really interesting sort of breakdown. And so let's step into each one of those into a little bit more detail. And let's really list out the features, because there were lots. There was a lot covered in this keynote. So you'd be mistaken to think much wasn't actually announced. But if you sort of go through it as a list, like I've written this whole thing out, and it's a long list of stuff. So let's go into this and really break it down. So the single platform section was very much about making sure that you understand that, look, if you have this workload, if you have this challenge inside of Snowflake, you shouldn't have to go elsewhere to get it done. And so they really showcased a bunch of features and a bunch of demos all working within Snowflake. This was sort of the emphasis. If you want to do this, you can do it in Snowflake. If you want to do that, you can do it in Snowflake, to the point where you could think of another solution, and again the answer should be you can do it in Snowflake. And so the first example was this really I think impressive demo of using AI and machine learning to essentially process documents. And they had, as I put it up on screen, they had a demo on the right hand side of a document. It was a mixture of handwritten text and typed text. On the left, you had essentially a way to query that document using machine learning and AI, with a simultaneous interface that also allows you to train and improve the quality of the model as you're querying the data. So it's essentially a really smart way of pairing training with out of the box capability. I can't remember the exact phrase that the presenter used, but there's a term for that, and essentially means that out of the box you get some immediate value, but also it means once you start to train it, once you start to improve the quality of the data, the model's going to improve over time. And as long as you sort of keep sort of feeding this engine a little bit more context, you're always then going to be able to have a more reliable sort of use case. And it gave confidence scores for its ability to tag and recognize all of the bits of information that were in each of these documents. But I thought it was a really good demo. To me, it's one of the few demos I've seen recently that I think was just out of the box convincing, because you could see the document, you could see what the software was doing. The interface wasn't sort of ridiculously complex. And then to finish it off, we kind of went off to another part of the demo where we were just able to go ahead, create the table, query it, bring it into Snowflake, and then use those columns that you'd queried as just a simple query in a SQL statement. And so that was nice to see, this end-to-end vision of here's a new feature, here's how it works. It's really simple. It's in a familiar place. It's in the platform. And by the way, everything the platform can do, you can do it all here already as well. So that was really good. And we then had a little bit of a focus on platform privacy, essentially all the little features that Snowflake has implemented to allow you to really control privacy. And I think this is an important sort of placement, because before you talk a lot about AI, you really have to give people the confidence that you're able to help them handle the privacy and essentially compliance requirements that are required in some markets as well. So that was a really good flex. I'll put a sort of graphic up on screen of all the different areas that they covered, but it's pretty straightforward. I think every company has a deck like this internally, but it's just great to see Snowflake doing it, in a very specific way and calling it out. I think it was actually mentioned on stage as well. And then you had the focus on performance. Now, this is a weird one because performance is one of those thankless things. When you make something go faster, or when you make it fail less, everyone goes like, yeah, well done, you're doing your job. And so Allison Lee actually came up and was talking about the performance improvements. She mentions a ton of them, and she quite rightly highlighted that, look, if these are working, then you should be noticing faster performance, and you should also be noticing things failing less often. And they don't deserve a gold star for that because, you're their customer. They're trying to make you happy. But they did also highlight that, look, when they make and deploy these benefits, you do get a benefit as well, because if things are running faster and they're failing less often, then because Snowflake is a usage-based pricing setup, you're also saving money in other words. So I think that was a really nice sort of point there. And they then went on to talk about the performance index, essentially a way of really understanding what's improving inside of Snowflake, so you could get a better sort of feel for that. And then another thing they touched on was this idea of being able to essentially control how utilization is being used through budgets. So essentially being able to set a budget for a particular individual or specific roles, and then not only getting alerts when they cross over that budget, but also getting alerts when they're on the trend to go over that target. And that's really useful because it allows you to sort of give various teams or various people essentially a walled setup that kind of gives them a bit of room to grow. It can encourage a conversation if they're using up their space too quickly. And I think the other nice thing about this is it maybe gives confidence for people to start thinking about buying consumption up front, because they know they can budget the consumption and they can move that sort of consumption around if maybe someone's under or over. And you can kind of create a small economy within an organization to sort of handle this as well. And the last one that, to be honest, I don't quite fully appreciate the benefit of this yet, but this warehouse utilization metric. Now, I've always thought warehouse utilization is something that you're really only focused on when you're part of the optimization discussion. And so it'd be interesting to see exactly what the warehouse utilization measures and sort of how that's broken down. So it's one of those things you have to see, and I think you have to be really detailed about Snowflake to really understand what it's doing as well. So that was really nice. And then to sort of cover all of these features off, they brought on a customer called Fidelity, and Fidelity just talked about their experience of building on the Snowflake platform. It's one of these things that it's just nice to have a customer speaking to exactly what you've mentioned already, and making sure that everything you're saying can be grounded in real world use cases and customers who are fundamentally happy and want to grow their usage of the platform. So that was the end of the single platform section. I've just sort of gone through some of the announcements there, but I think it was a really strong section. It showed people things that they're familiar with within Snowflake, but also showed improvements. And no doubt, if you go to other sessions, you'll probably get a lot more detail about this, especially the What's New session, I think is being called as the session to go to if you want to know how these things all work in detail. So definitely go check that out. But that was the end of the single platform section. Next, we're going to go to the next section, which is about deploy, distributed, and monetize. Essentially, really inviting companies to come and build on the Snowflake platform. Let's check that out. So for this section, Snowflake really sort of changed the narrative, and it's a very subtle change. I mean, I only noticed this on my second watch. In essence, at this point, Snowflake had been talking almost entirely to the analysts, to the people using the platform. And then they suddenly changed to talking to what I would call entrepreneurs within the community, to essentially say, look, so these are all the features. Now we're enabling you to come build something, deploy it in a secure and governed way, and then monetize it. So they're essentially talking to developers and opportunist people who want to come in and build on the Snowflake platforms and create a business. And they actually brought in a customer called Cyber, I think it was Cyber, and they talked about what they're doing, how they've set things up, and what they're hoping to do, the apps they're hoping to sell within the ecosystem. But they're not just coming to the marketplace with apps, they're coming with marketplace apps and data sort of coupled together to give you a really unique capability with their service offerings. So it was very much, I sort of think of this as the kind of pitch that Apple would have to do, not to us as consumers, but to developers to come and build apps that can then be monetized. And so to speak to that, they showed a whole bunch of different capabilities. Now, I'm not a developer, so to be brutally honest, I don't get the significance of half of these things. So if you do know the significance, if some of these are going to change your life, let me know in the comments. I'd really love to know more about it. But they talked about the app framework, essentially a framework for building apps. I'll come back to apps in a second, because there was one thing I just fundamentally don't agree with, sorry, and I'll come to it in a short minute, but let me just go through this list. They talk about app framework being in public preview. So essentially a bunch of apps are already available, and now it's in public preview. Lots more people can actually start covering it and using it. So that's going to be something interesting to watch over the next 6 months. Apps are not easy to build, so we're going to probably spend the next year seeing how apps are being built well, how they're being built badly, and sort of best practice sort of coalescing around that. Now, alongside app frameworks, they also talked about something called event billing, which allows you to essentially charge users based on events rather than just the classic usage model that had previously been there. So you could specify whether the app charges on a specific type of query that's run, and then essentially from there, you're then able to, really actually monetize your application in a way that probably wasn't possible or feasible or usable before. Because again, pricing is really difficult, and if you've got more flexibility to really change the way you price, you can actually end up giving the customer better value, but also coalesce around, exactly where the value in the idea you have is. The other thing was this setup called capacity drawdown, which essentially allows customers to buy capacity up front and then have apps draw down from that capacity, including typical things like compute and storage. So actually apps, I think the feature here is that apps have the security to know that customers who do have capacity drawdown can just go ahead and start using their apps, and those apps will be getting the benefit from the previous existing commitments that customers have already made, rather than having to go out and sign new statements of work or new contracts or whatever just to use an app, which I think was probably the issue before. Companies, when they buy software, they tend to be very prescriptive about what they're getting. So they might get a sort of commitment-based pricing set up, but that didn't account for apps, or that didn't account for a specific capability. So that was good to see. Now, this brings me to an area that I was super confused by, which was they kept on showing what to me felt like dashboards, but they kept on calling them apps. And I just never really got any clarity as to what Snowflake actually considers as an app. Now, in some cases, I saw really good examples of that, because we had, interfaces with forms and, the kind of things you'd expect in an app, and a user interface, a way for someone to inject something and get something back out of value. But in other cases, we just saw essentially dashboards and charts. So I think the jury's out on me, at least, to really understand what exactly is an app in the Snowflake system, because there's a lot of mention of applications and apps. But I think I found it really hard to parse out the different tiers or the different sort of complexities, or how simple or advanced they have to be. And then the final thing was we got a demo, of course, and the demo was really sort of just a way of piecing it all together. And I think it was one of those really nice sort of demos, because it really showed everything working inside of the platform. Again, this was just a very sort of consistent theme throughout the whole event. We had the feature, the example, and then you had the demo just showing you it working almost live. The problem with a lot of Snowflake features is they go into preview for a long period of time. Then they come into general availability. And the reason they're in preview, as Frank said himself, was they like to test these things and make sure they work. So when they were in preview, you have to be given access to go and see them and use them. But once they're in general availability, then they're officially supported and they're public, and everyone can start using them as long as you're in the right pricing tier to enable that specific feature. Okay, that's the end of that section. Let's move on to the final section, which was actually about programmability, but really it was talking to developers. Let's get stuck in. So this last bit was really quite interesting. It was mostly focused on developers, essentially telling developers, hey, you've been asking us for a bunch of things. We've listened. Here they all are. And so we had capability showing us how streaming pipelines worked. I think this was a really nice demo, because it showed the evolution of how sort of Snowflake is built on this capability over time, with Snowpipe as a starting point, but now really going through the rest of the workflow and allowing you to build on really much more complex pipelines all the way through the entire setup. They had this sort of very brief demo of a no-code SQL, essentially just being able to type what you wanted to happen and have Snowflake come up with a SQL for you. And I found that demo interesting. I sort of critiqued that a little bit in my full breakdown of the whole entire summit. And I kind of said, well, that's great, but you still need someone to check it. And to check it, you need to know your stuff. So if you know your stuff, you're probably not going to use AI. And so you just write the thing yourself. It's kind of one of these snake eating its own tail sort of visualization. But nonetheless, it was nice to see that working. A certain other competitor company has also announced something very, very similar. similar. So it's always interesting how these things go down, but no less, I'm not surprised that Snowflake announced it at their event too. The other thing was Snowpark Container Services. And again, for this one, I just don't know enough about Snowflake's implementation and containers to understand where the value is. Now, containers typically in technology allow you to run a system in a let's just think about it as a walled garden, but a very sort of opaque walled garden. So you can set up an application inside of a container, and as far as the application is concerned, all it sees is the operating system. It doesn't know about any other application that's sitting next to it, below it, whatever. And so in a traditional setup, you can put all of these apps into containers. You put them into Snowflake. They're all running on Snowflake, but they don't have any awareness of each other, which is good for security. It's good for a little bit of governance. Those apps don't need to know about other applications, so why would they need to see them? And also from an upgrade and stability perspective, if something goes wrong with one of the containers, you can just stand up another one very quickly and you don't disrupt all the other systems. Whereas if you take your computer as an example, if something goes wrong and your computer crashes, as soon as you hit restart, everything running on your computer has to also restart. That's not how containers work. Containers allow you to just be modular and sort of pick and choose how things are working. So I don't fully understand Snowflake's implementation in Snowpark. Remember, Snowpark is the data engineering, AI, and application sort of group of products, if that makes sense. So I think I have to really come back and unpick the value of the container in this specific setup. But nonetheless, it was great to see this as a demo. We did actually see it working. And then the demo went on to cover LLMs in a little bit more detail. LLMs are just something that I think every company feels they have to demo on stage. But nonetheless, it was good to see it. It was good to see it working. And then at the very end of this session, they essentially brought out 10 demos from, I think was it 10 demos? Yeah, it was 10 demos from different companies who've all built apps inside of this new setup around containers. So I think this was a really, really nice demo, really nice setup, because it was kind of like a big thing to ask to have that many companies, and there weren't small companies. We're talking about companies such as Alteryx, Nvidia, all of these companies building capabilities for the specific one feature, allowing you to do things you wouldn't think would only run in Snowflake, but now here they are turning up with their capabilities, letting you do exactly that. So I thought it was a pretty nice way to end the keynote, leave people excited and infused to go off and talk to lots of the customers and partners as well. And so that was it. That's the whole keynote. Pretty much we've blitzed through the whole entire thing. I really enjoyed the keynote. It's my first Snowflake Summit, and I only watched it virtually. I didn't actually go. And I found it really interesting. I found it, I compared it during my full breakdown to the Tableau keynote, and I said Snowflake is obviously in a very different place. It knows what its product is, it knows where it's heading, and all it has to do is please its existing consumers. Whereas Tableau, on the other hand, when I went through that keynote, I talked a lot about how it's wanting to now pivot to a group of users it's never had to serve before. And so it got very different vibes as a result of that. And I'm pretty excited about the direction of Snowflake. But there were a few things I didn't see. There was a call out for governance a lot throughout the whole entire keynote. But what we didn't see was like an explicit sort of bunch of features. And by that, I mean, governance seemed to be sort of peppered in. When we were going through the demo for distributed, deploy, and monetize, there was this sort of mention of observability, but that's observability. It's not quite the same as governance. And so maybe that's sort of my naivety to the product. I haven't been exposed enough to know how Snowflake communicates governance, but that just to me was just a section that sort of didn't jump out, even though Frank mentioned it at the start. I didn't feel like it jumped out from this whole keynote. The other thing I think was Snowflake didn't really, if you're new to databases, if you're a company, you've just bought Snowflake and you went to this summit or you saw this keynote, you might feel a little bit overwhelmed because essentially Snowflake might have shown you a bunch of things you've not even started to think about. And it's one of those sort of interesting decisions where in this sort of play to show where you're heading, to show the innovation, you can potentially marginalize your user base that aren't going to ever use it for more than just the simple thing of a data warehouse or a data lake. because that's really all some people still want, right? And they showed that sort of massive diagram, and you had all these companies around the outside. Those are the companies I'm talking about. The companies that don't want to collaborate, can't collaborate. People like me, I'm a one-person band. I'm a content creator. I use Snowflake because it's a pretty reliable database for piping my YouTube data from Fivetran into a database, and it's cost effective. I can actually afford to pay for Snowflake as a content creator who doesn't, by the way, doesn't make a profit on making content. So it's really super interesting to sort of see how Snowflake speaks to that customer. By chasing all this innovation, you could end up sort of marginalizing those smaller organizations who maybe are 2 or 3 people, maybe get a lot of value out of the platform, but are never going to be running Snowpark, are never going to be running these AI machine learning setups. They're not Capital One. They're not, all these companies that Snowflake had on stage. And so that was another thing I thought of, if you're a small customer, what's Snowflake doing to help you? What are the soft skills that they can set up? In the Tableau world, I think of things like the Tableau blueprint. Although that's not perfect, I think Snowflake needs an equivalent sort of here's how to deploy Snowflake kind of guide. And I know these things exist. There are white papers, videos, guides, session, conference talks, all of this stuff. But what I really mean is a feature that really helps you walk through these steps and helps you navigate sort of the soft skills. But anyway, those are my thoughts. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown. If you think I've missed anything, let me know in the comments. It's the first time I've done a breakdown of Summit, so go easy on me. If there's things I can improve on next time, I'm always open to feedback. But yeah, I'm pretty excited to start covering Snowflake. I'm going to be pushing on with this at least once a week to try and really bring up a bunch of new content on this space. And lastly, I think the other thing I sort of just want to touch on is, and there's going to be lots more content at this conference that I'll probably end up covering over the next 2 weeks. So it's not all going to come at once like it does with Tableau. I think it's going to take me more time to sort of go through it, but I'll slowly, maybe over the next month, bring out all of the sort of breakdowns of the conference sessions that I found interesting. And if you want to see those, let me know in the comments below. If there's any particular sessions you'd love to see covered, let me also know those in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.